Hi, my name is Amrita and this is Amrita by the Book, my booktube channel, where today I'd like to address the question of whether we should be still teaching classics or the English canon to young school children. And I feel like this is a question that I have addressed tangentially in multiple videos on my channel, but over the past few weeks, this has been a question that has exploded across book Twitter, and it caused people to behave in the most extraordinary fashion, in my opinion, and I thought that that deserved a specific video. And when I say it caused people to behave in an extraordinary fashion, I mean extraordinarily racist. So one of the things that you might not know about me is that I went to writing school. And when I was in writing school, we had all these discussions about the canon and what constituted it and how we should diversify it. And I was very new to the United States at the time. And so I had lived in India, where we have our own different issues and our own different problems between communities, but we practice a very different kind of multiculturalism from the United States. And I remember sitting in class and thinking, what is the big deal? This is because I am an Indian, and I'm an Indian from a very anglicized Anglophone background, which means that we really grew up in a colonial hangover, but we weren't really aware of it at the time. So all the things that people are debating today, all the British classics such as Dickens and Hardy and so on, these are things that we weren't even given an opportunity to debate, like, should we be reading these people? No, of course not. We will be reading these people. And there was zero attempt made at contextualizing what these writings meant, about how it related to us as Indians. It was just, this is what good literature is, and it was given to us that way, and that is how we consumed it. And it wasn't until I was in that classroom in New York City that I had an opportunity to sit down and examine not just these books, but also my relationship with them as a reader and a consumer of the ideas in those books. So that's my background coming into this discussion. Now let's look at what happened on Twitter. So basically there is a black educator called Lorena Germán, and I mention her race because it's important. Germán is part of she runs an organization called Disrupt Text, and it basically talks about diversification of the kind of reading material that is available to school children. And it's part of various different conversations that played into other conversations that we were having on book Twitter that week. So for example, Vuong, who is perhaps one of the most famous contemporary poets, had this story up on his Instagram where he was answering people's questions, and he talked about metaphors in his poetry, and there was this whole kerfuffle about how he doesn't know his grammar well enough or something, because he said something that made it sound as if he was confusing metaphors and similes. And literally you had people extrapolating all sorts of nonsense from that, and they basically made it sound as if he didn't know English well enough to be writing poetry in it, and how his entire oeuvre was suspect due to that. Now, if you've read Vuong, and if you have read his poetry, then you know how ridiculous that is. And there are other poets, other writers who've pointed out that a lot of this, Ocean doesn't really know English well enough to be writing this, is people who are coming from a place of deep jealousy because he is so famous and he is so successful in a very niche part of the market. I mean, poetry, it's like, tiny. And if you can actually make a living at it, that makes you incredibly elite. And so obviously that comes with a lot of envy and resentment. And then you had Germán, who was talking about diversifying and expanding the canon, and Jessica Clues, who is a YA author, jumped into it and got weirdly, incredibly angry about it. Like, she took it really personal that Germán thought that, modern children shouldn't be reading the works of old white men who've been dead for like 2 centuries. And she was really aggressive about it, and then people called her out, and she put forward this very boilerplate PR apology. And in the middle of all that, you also had David Bowles, and he's an educator as well, and he spoke about how brown and black people who are in the field of literature, whether they are studying it or whether they are teaching it or they are writing it, they have to always prove that they know better than, any random white person. And he threw in a little bit about, how he has a PhD, how he speaks multiple languages and so on and so forth. And then all the racists got like, oh, look at this uppity dude. He thinks he's somebody because he has a PhD and he speaks multiple languages. Which, you know what, if you have a PhD and you speak multiple languages, then that is something to be proud of. That is a serious achievement. Try doing it if you don't believe me. But basically what I'm trying to say is that this whole thing just snowballed, and people who I'm very sure have never read a book, much less a book that is part of the canon, started commenting on it and started coming into it, and it was all this, how dare you take away the work of our ancestors. And I'm just like, what are you even talking about? It was ridiculous. Now, usually I wouldn't make a video, much less give much thought to this kind of idiocy, but as I said, this does touch upon a topic that I have discussed tangentially elsewhere on this channel, and I thought this was a good time to just talk about what I mean when I talk about contextualization and diversification of the canon. First of all, the canon doesn't exist, in a free-floating state. It's not complete into and unto itself. The people who wrote it weren't writing it because they thought, oh, we are now setting the standards for centuries of literature. Like, nobody who is writing, nobody sane who is writing, writes like that. And the people that we are talking about these days, a lot of them were writing literally by the word, which is why so many of those books are so massive. And they were criticized as such during their time. A lot of people have really low opinions, like 19th century people had really low opinions of Dickens, for example. Or if you want to go even further back, he didn't write books, but Shakespeare. He was considered the lowest of the low, and now he's a linchpin of the English literature. So there is a context within which these people were writing, and there is a cultural context and there is a linguistic context within which these works were being written, and that changes and evolves as time goes on. Language itself evolves, like, for example, if you're looking at what constitutes popular language, I'm talking in English, you're listening to this in English. What is English? Is it what is spoken in England? I have lived in England, and let me tell you, half the time I had no idea what any of them were saying, because the way the English speak in England is so varied and so regional and so different from, say, what you would see on The Crown on Netflix. But also a lot of the English that we see on social media, for instance, you can call it American English, but a lot of the American English that we speak today is actually African American vernacular English. So much of the slang that we speak today, and it troubles me because so many people are not aware of that context. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this point where Noah Cyrus, I think, Miley Cyrus's younger sister, was calling out some black woman and called her nappy-haired, which is a very specific racialized slur. And it's fine when black people say that to black people, or maybe it's not fine, I don't know. But for a white woman to use that, and then she said that, she wasn't even aware that it was a racial slur. Do I believe her? I don't know. But I do believe that there are multiple things that we say in the English language today, in a sort of international English, that is taken from very specific African American contexts, and not a lot of people know that. Which is why sometimes I'm just cringing my way through social media, because there are terms that are being used in a completely inappropriate way, where the grammar is wrong, the syntax is wrong, and they don't know because, they think it's just English and you can just use it per English rules. But racism is really the tip of the problem. A lot of the activists who are calling for these books to be removed from the curriculum and to be replaced by, say, YA, for instance, they're not doing it out of a sort of racial animus. They're doing it because a lot of the people who are reading these books might be from non-English speaking backgrounds or from non-reading backgrounds. And it's really difficult for children to connect to works that were written 200 years ago in England. I think it was Derek Walcott, I'll have to check, but he pointed out that, we all grew up across the former British Empire. We grew up reading Daffodils, the poem, and none of us had ever seen a daffodil, which is a weed in England, but, you don't find daffodils in the Caribbean or in India. Or maybe you do find daffodils in India, but not in most of India. So if you're not able to connect to these books, if you're not able to understand the emotional language of these books, then what are these books doing? From a colonialist perspective, it is basically reinforcing the superiority of the original, so to speak. You have this language, but even within that language, there is a caste system. So when you are a newcomer or you come in and you say, well, this is my language, I use it this way, it is always an innovation, which by itself is not bad, but it's always seen as inferior. And that is a perception that a lot of these people are trying to fight against. But secondly, it's also about giving kids an easier access to reading. The explosion that we've seen in the YA market over the past few years, for example, or the past couple of decades, it comes from kids being able to talk about things that are important to them. It comes from kids being able to connect to stories and to feelings and the big feelings that they don't really know where to put or how to address. So you have, queer fiction in YA. You have explorations of atypical neurology. You have talk about depression and about mental health issues. These are all things that kids have felt for generations, as long as they have been people. But YA allows them to experience and to connect with these stories and these feelings and challenges in ways that make sense to them and their context, and to see themselves in these books. Representation is so important. And because we have evolved as a society, and hopefully we have evolved, we are now discussing things that people 200 years ago either didn't have the language to discuss or found it taboo to discuss. So what do? Do we just throw everything out that came before and just start anew? There are people who believe that, and they have really strong arguments. But for me, I personally think that there is a middle path to be followed. I think it is important to see where things began and from what we have evolved. But I don't think it's necessary for us to begin with that or to lead with that. And I think it helps to wait until, kids are a little bit older. Maybe they're in high school before you start throwing 19th century English novelists at them and saying, well, this is what we used to be. And when you do present those books, you need to contextualize them. You need to understand that books aren't written in a vacuum, that authors don't grow up in a vacuum. They're not universally relatable. They weren't universally relatable even at the time that they were writing those novels. I think kids deserve a chance to love their reading, and it can be in anything. It could be, graphic novels, DC and Marvel comics. I've spoken about this before, but I started reading because of Flash Gordon comics. I was 3 years old and I thought everything was really bright and pretty. I honestly feel that orthodoxy is not something that we should inflict upon children, and they deserve a chance to explore the world on their own terms before we start filling their heads with stuff. And I also feel that the canon needs to be diversified. I think that things have changed so much over the past 200 years. Surely we can find other authors and other writers from diverse backgrounds who have experimented and perfected form, who do interesting, thrilling things with language, who explain the world in their own terms, who can inspire a love of language and ideas, who are doing truly novel things with their work. And mostly, I think people can relax a little bit. If the thought of contextualizing or diversifying the canon turns you into a racist, aggressive mess, it's time to sort of take a look at yourself. What is wrong with you? But it's been instructive for me to see the kind of mass hysteria that this question threw up on Twitter, because it makes me realize that at a fundamental level, it might be a subconscious level, but they do understand what these books are propping up. The culture and the feeling of superiority, that they understand that the ideas in these novels, that the worldview that is espoused by the protagonists of these novels, they go a great deal towards the upkeep and proliferation of standards of patriarchy and racial superiority, not to mention a whole bunch of other things. And that is why I don't think of this as being mere Twitter drama. I think these are fundamental questions that we need to talk to each other about. And the more discussion that we have about these things, the better we all will be. An examination of ourselves, of our attitudes, of the prevalent standards and why they are the prevalent standards. I think there are novels that definitely deserve to be discarded. And I think there are authors that we can still learn from. And I think it's unlikely that every country will find, a one-size-fits-all solution to this idea. I think every country needs to keep in mind its population, its history, and its needs for, the current population. I honestly don't think a canon should or can be a static form of being. I'm really interested to know what you all think, if you have strong opinions. Is this something that makes you really angry? Is this something that, you could take it or leave it? Do you have kids? Do you have intentions about how you want to raise your kids to read? Could you not care less? Let me know in the comments below.